Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us for our September meeting. We are very fortunate this morning to have three wonderful speakers with us. We're going to talk about some very important issues. They're going to be sharing strategies for continuing DEI's work in the face of opposition, including building strong partnerships, identifying the all-important alternative funding sources, and reframing DEI work to highlight its benefits for every member of our community. And before I turn it over to them, I want to talk to you a little bit, as I always do, about some of the things that we've been doing. One of the things that we were very excited about, I believe very strongly that, and I know this is true, for instance, as well for Chief Cronin, the police departments, I believe that the courts should reflect the people that we serve. And we have, over the last decade, made a real effort to diversify our office, both in terms of our lawyers and our advocates, in terms of language and all of that, to be very culturally competent. And a big piece of that was that the week of August 4th, the National Black Prosecutors Association brought their annual conference to the Westin Copley here in Boston. And that was a great platform for prosecutors of color and really all of us to network, to learn, to grow professionally. And our office and the Suffolk DA's office, coupled with the U.S. Attorney's Office, had worked for over a year to bring this conference to Boston for the very first time. It's an incredibly prestigious event. Obviously, and this is a piece of our history that we talk about so often, people had some concerns about coming here to Boston. And we spent an enormous amount of time assuring people that we could present a conference that would address so many issues, that people would be welcome. There'd be amazing things for them to see here in Boston. And it's important because the NBPA is the only professional membership organization that's dedicated to advancing the work of Black lawyers as prosecutors. And several of the attorneys in our office, including myself, Antonia, really had the honor of participating. We shared insights and experience on things like the restorative justice work we do, racial equity in the legal system, best practice for conducting investigations. And it was a great opportunity to meet people, to network. And as part of that commitment, the Massachusetts District Attorney's Office hosted a social event at my alma mater, Emmanuel College, that was moderated by Emmanuel's president, Beth Ross, and Dr. Noel Trent, the president and CEO of the Museum of African American History in Boston, as well as Professor Petros Vamakis, who is the director of the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies at Emmanuel. And it was really focused around the fact that Emmanuel is fortunate enough to own the home of William Lloyd Garrison, and who played such an important role in the abolitionist movement. So we were able to bring that history to our visitors. Also just get to have an opportunity to really see that beautiful part of Boston, sort of the Fenway Park, the Greenway, all of that. So that was important. On August 21st, and this is going to become particularly relevant actually beginning tomorrow, we hosted a virtual forum for the leaders of colleges and universities, not just the 21 in our county, but we invited people from across the state preparing for the return of students to campus. And we talked about what plans they could make to secure public safety for students, for faculty, staff, and campus visitors, both while dealing with the national rise in incidents in hate and violence, and anticipating, what may happen over the course of this election and the transfer of power between now and January of 2025. And we talked about the importance of having sound policies, having a mechanism for information sharing and implementing responses, and all with the shared goal, really, of public safety and keeping both the public and parents and others who were connected to the campus just aware of what was happening. And we had both public and private colleges and universities there. Sarah Affel, who began her work in our office, but is now counsel at Seaforth Shaw, talked about navigating cultural flashpoints. She really highlighted the importance of living and learning and making that environment both legally compliant and consistent with the institutional's values. We also had representatives from Tufts, MIT, and Harvard, former police commissioner, Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis, to have a collaborative panel about just what are the safety issues. So that was an important program. We are already beginning to see an uptick in those kinds of issues. So hopefully, we always try to be anticipating what is the next thing and how do we get people prepared for that. So hopefully we've done a good job with that. And finally, I'm pleased to announce that our office is launching a new telephone line dedicated to reporting instances of hate and bias. We want to make it easier for people to make those reports promptly and efficiently. And it's part of our broader strategy. And we encourage all the stakeholders, including local organizations, community leaders, and residents, to share the information. If you help us by posting details on your website or your social media, and it's our hope that people will use this to get us the information as quickly as possible, so we can be sure, number one, we are responding appropriately and working with our law enforcement and community partners to do that. And then also thinking about how can we best utilize our resources going forward in terms of where is training needed, where do we need community response, restorative circles, whatever it may be. And as I say all the time, one of my most important focuses is making sure that people who are in this county, whether they live here, they work here, they go to school here, do not have to wonder whether they belong. And all of these moves are really aimed at making this a safer and more inclusive community. So we'll be sending out more information about how you access that telephone line. And we've also expanded our web page with additional resources for hate crime victims. And it's crucial that people know where those services are. And who can help them in the moment. And it often is weekends and holidays and all of that. So we have all of that information. We really encourage you, especially those of you who join our task force, if you're looking at that and there are things that you see we're missing or ways that we can make that better, we'd really like to do that. Or if you offer services that we haven't included, please let us know that as well. And Antonio or Alice, if you could drop just the website and where they go in the chat so people can take a look at that. So turning to our speakers, and as we are listening, and this is the same message, as we're listening to their insights and experiences, think about how you can be taking these lessons back to your own organizations and your own communities. And how can we really reinvigorate our commitment to diversity and inclusion and coming together? I had the opportunity to attend some 9/11 events yesterday and was really reminded, as so many people talked about, the world would be, and our country would be, a very different place if we were all still who we were on September 12th of 2001, when we really came together and really united to help people to address what was going on. And that spirit, which seems to have faded a little bit, but is certainly capable of being revived, is what we are looking to be doing. So our first presenter today is Leah Watson, who is joined by Kim Conway. And Leah is the senior staff attorney with the Racial Justice Initiative at the ACLU. And she focuses in that spot on classroom censorship efforts, educational gag orders, actually, bias in policing, the criminalization of poverty, and the racial disparities that were really laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic. She previously served as senior counsel in the Criminal Justice Process Project at the WIS Committee for Civil Rights. There she led the litigation that challenged debtors' prisons and excessive fines and fees in both Arkansas and Oklahoma. Leah has co-authored reports, delivered community trainings, and developed policy recommendations around fines and fees reforms at both the state and local level. And as many of you know, this is something we've been involved in a great deal with legislation, particularly around the fees that are charged by the Registry of Motor Vehicles and often cause people not to be able to have a valid license. And that circle they kind of fall into. You can't pay the fees, so you don't have a valid license. You have to go to work. You have to take your kids to school, so you keep driving and you keep driving up those fines. Leah launched the Protect, a guide for law enforcement engagement with students of color. And prior to that, she was a senior associate at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher and an associate at Baker Hostella. She led cross-border investigations in one of the top 10 largest Foreign Corruption Practices Act settlements. She was a member of the trial team that secured victory in the largest residential-backed securities trial in history. Leah was also successful in obtaining special immigrant juvenile status and custody orders for some of her pro bono clients and successfully challenged some of those pro bono clients' criminal convictions. During a 6-month externship that she did at the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Leah represented clients in disability rights, police misconduct, fair housing, and wage theft cases. Leah graduated from Harvard Law School and then prior to that had taught high school in Atlanta, Georgia through Teach for America. She is joined by Kim Conway, who is the Senior Policy Counsel at ACLU. Kim has been actively involved in addressing issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has recently also spoken out against efforts to undermine DEI initiatives, particularly in the context of potential policies that might come from a second Trump administration. She emphasizes that those efforts are not issues, but also First Amendment issues, because they involve attempts to control educational content, as well as discussions about race, gender, and systemic oppression. She is committed to defending DEI programs and ensuring that marginalized groups are having their rights protected. So I'm really happy to welcome both Kim and Leah this morning. Thank you for making time to be with us.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So as you mentioned, I'm Leah Watson. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here. I know Kim is as well. I'll just start with jumping in right on a little bit of level setting, because we hear the term DEI tossed around a lot in the media and by conservatives, and they mean for it to be a catch-all for anything they don't like. So I just want to clarify what DEI actually is. And here we're talking about efforts to increase representation, fair treatment, the ability of people to make of everyone on a team to make meaningful contributions. These are efforts that occur across institutions in education, workplaces, other places as well. Consistently, research has shown that DEI is beneficial for everyone, not just the underrepresented groups, but increasing collaboration, learning, engagement across teams. And then I also want to just pause for a moment, because there are so many myths about what DEI is, and I want to clarify those as well. The first that I hear a lot is that DEI conflicts or is the antithesis of meritocracy, and that is really an unfortunate spin, intentional spin, because DEI is designed to make sure that qualified candidates have access to roles and opportunities that are a good fit for them. And a lot of times you'll see things contrasted. Either you can believe in DEI or you can believe in merit, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Another point is that DEI divides Americans, and as you'll see later on, studies across the board consistently show the overwhelming majority of Americans believe in and support and want DEI efforts in their workplaces and their lives, because they believe in these principles individually. And then also that DEI undermines diversity. I hear this sometimes in the higher education context, which is a euphemism that they've been able to use in order to conservatives have used to justify removal of support specifically for underrepresented groups. And so in the name of diversity, removing the supports that allow diverse students to feel comfortable and on campus. So there we're talking about some of the like Black student resources, maybe the Black Student Association, or other housing options, supports, cultural centers that have traditionally been used to make sure people feel supported. One top line that I think is really important is that DEI is certainly under attack. There's no debating that, but it is not dead. And when I say it's not dead, I mean a few different things. One, people still want DEI overwhelmingly. Two, courts have not declared DEI dead and have not struck down all DEI efforts. Even just thinking about the definition we just discussed, DEI encompasses a really broad range of initiatives, and no court has said that all DEI is dead. And courts are continuing while there is litigation pending, which we'll talk about that. It's not the case that every case that's brought, courts are striking down DEI. That's just an overstatement. And I see reported very consistently that companies, organizations are stepping back from DEI because they're afraid of being sued. They're afraid that they're going to be attacked or giving in to pressure. And I think it's really important that we hold the line on that and consistently continue to offer DEI efforts that improve schools and government settings, businesses across the board. So I'll just start very briefly with talking about how did we get here with this attack on DEI. One data point, this is a timeline. It's a little bit hard to read. I'm sorry about that. But I'll explain the pieces individually. One, I like to start with 2017, just as a proxy for the changing racial dynamics, demographics in our country. For the first time, white students became the minority in public schools. This is something that had been talked about for decades. It's a data point that would reflect the changing demographics in this country. And this was the first time that changed. It was a very scary time for some people. We saw an uptick in rhetoric about the Great Replacement theory, that any progress on behalf of BIPOC people comes at the expense of white people. And a lot of that rhetoric was rumbling in certain groups, but it really came to a rise in May 2020 following where there was a brief racial reckoning in this country following the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. You'll remember schools, businesses, all types of institutions were talking about anti-racism, making commitments to anti-racism, increasing their commitments to DEI, and thinking about how we all can play a role in eradicating racism and moving towards racial justice. That progress towards racial justice had an almost immediate backlash. In September of 2020, just a few months later, then former President Trump issued Executive Order 13950, which prohibited instruction and trainings about racism and sexism in federal agencies and federal contractors. Portions of that order were struck down later in December of 2020, but it really set the model for censoring discussions of racism and sexism in the federal government. And then after the election in 2020, we saw these far-right conservatives who had celebrated the executive order move to a state-based strategy. And the first focus of that state-based strategy was in education. So we saw a number of laws, which we call educational gag orders, introduced that prohibit instruction and also trainings on racism and sexism in K-12 and higher education. That focus on censorship is something that I've spent a lot of time on, and seeing how conservatives really pushed the narratives to reach that point. And then we also saw an almost immediate pivot to, in late 2022, to laws prohibiting DEI. One thing that has been significant in our work in the ACLU, specifically a case that I'm leading in Florida, we're challenging a law called the Stop Woke Act, which severely limits the ability of K-12, higher education, and even businesses to talk about racism and sexism in trainings or instruction. So we filed a lawsuit challenging the higher education provisions. In August of 2022, we've received an injunction blocking the state from enforcing the law in higher education in November of 2022. And then shortly, just a month or two after we received that injunction, the state legislature introduced a law to prohibit DEI instead, notably as a way of avoiding the impact of our order. So we're seeing this across the board. And one thing that's important to know is that the same people and the same playbook that was used for educational censorship is what we're seeing in the impact. It's what we're seeing in the attack on DEI. By the same players, I mean the Manhattan Institute, Chris Rufo, the Claremont Institute, Heritage Foundation, leading these efforts, and even admitting that they're using the exact same tactics. Here we have a vocal minority that is attempting to eradicate something that's very popular generally. We've seen a lot of narrative shifts of the sort that I was talking about earlier, where DEI is used as an antithesis of meritocracy, or something that is being used to draw a wedge between people who would otherwise agree, even though people do overwhelmingly agree that these principles are important. A lot of this has been leveraged in the media, both initially in conservative media, but also the leaders of this movement have talked about the need to increase media coverage and leverage the media across the board. So it's not just far right outlets anymore that are talking about this. And then efforts to conflate the term DEI with anything that conservatives disfavor and use that as a method to control. So here is just a chart that shows overwhelming support across the board for DEI across ages and races, and there is more support for Democrats and independents, but the takeaway is that DEI is still very popular. And then with conflation control, I have this quote from our vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, talking about DEI, and I just want you to see how he's using it. But in talking about DEI, he uses this to mock public health experts who encourage people to vaccinate their children because those experts went to a school that had DEI. And you'll see the theme here: receive an credential from the institution that cares more about checking a box than merit. A lot of these, I know you all are in Massachusetts, and we had a lot of this rhetoric specifically last fall and at the beginning of the year as well. So now I'll move on to the forms of attack, specifically, like, what does it mean to say that DEI is under attack? And we see this in a variety of ways. I talked about the educational gag orders that censor instruction on race and sex discrimination. We've now seen 39 laws in 20 states. Over 40 states have seen legislation introduced. Almost no place is immune to these efforts. And the ACLU has blocked these efforts in 3 different states where we're litigating. The only 3 states where we're litigating these issues directly. In Florida, I mentioned we blocked the law in higher education. In New Hampshire, in a recent victory in May, we received a final order from the court blocking the law in K-12. And in Oklahoma, we were able to completely block the law in higher education and partially in K-12. Each of these cases is on appeal currently. I've already argued the Florida case this summer, so we're waiting on an order any day from the 11th Circuit. But we are in the process of scheduling the briefing schedule in New Hampshire with the First Circuit, so that will be coming down the pipeline next. And things are moving a bit slower with the 10th Circuit in Oklahoma. Also, specifically to litigation challenging DEI, we've seen a lot of focus on programs to attract or retain diverse pools. 2 years ago, we had the affirmative action decision against Harvard, Students for Fair Admission. Those efforts are continuing. On Monday, I'll be traveling to Baltimore because that same group, Students for Fair Admissions, has filed similar lawsuits to military academies. So the trial for West Point starts on Monday. Military academies were explicitly carved out of the opinion, which is very narrow, actually. So continuing to litigate those challenges, also to affirmative action or efforts to diversify highly competitive high schools in the K-12 arena, continuing to see a lot of action there. We've seen challenges to financial aid programs that are awarded or consider race, sex, ethnicity, national origin, any of these protected categories as one of the consideration. DEI programs more generally in schools and in businesses, in government as well, including anti-bias trainings. We've also seen lawsuits challenging minority and women-owned contracting programs specifically because they do award contracts, at least partially considering race or sex as one of many other considerations. And then we've seen the same types of attacks in healthcare with social vulnerability indices. This came up a lot during the pandemic when there was a question about how to allocate limited quantities of the vaccine when it was first available. And some states, including New York, announced that they were going to use social vulnerability indices that consider a lot of information, including zip code and racial background, to figure out how to prioritize limited treatments. And then finally, representation on government boards. Sometimes they reserve a seat for a woman or a person of color, a minority in some way, to ensure representation, diversity of thought. And we've seen challenges to that as well. So these are a few lawsuits that are currently pending that we're tracking. But I just want to reemphasize that many of these are pending. Many of them get kicked out of court, and some of them, sometimes they do win in limited ways, but even the existence of litigation certainly doesn't mean that all DEI programs are dead. And I'll turn it over to Kim.
Thank you, Leah. So as Leah just touched upon with respect to the legislative landscape, and as you all may know, there has been a wide-scale dismantling and legislative attack on DEI programs within the education, employment, and public contracting sectors on the federal, state, and local government levels. Since last year alone, 90 federal and state bills restricting DEI in employment, education, and public contracting have been introduced. 14 of them have become law in 12 states. Between 2021 and 2023, 307 educational gag order state bills have been introduced. And as Leah mentioned, 39 of them have become law. There have also been 10 executive orders or other state policies that have become effective. Next slide. So the impacts of these attacks have and will continue to permeate throughout states and localities, local school districts, and public libraries. In the education sector specifically, the attacks seek to restrict the freedom of students to read, learn, and think about the history, lived experiences, and contributions of communities of color, those with shared ancestry and ethnic characteristics, the LGBTQ+ community, and women. They also seek to censor curricula, which includes courses, subjects, lessons, plans of study, assignments, readings, classroom lectures, and discussions. They further seek to censor instructional and library materials, which includes textbooks, magazines, social media apps, movies, songs, art, and plays, ban school groups, clubs, and other extracurricular affinity organizations, and prevent the recruitment and admission of diverse students and faculty. They also seek to engage in intrusive forms of monitoring of teachers and librarians. In the employment sector, the attack seeks to eliminate workplace non-discrimination and diversity training, addressing sex, race, color, ethnicity, and national origin, in addition to programs that aim to create welcoming and inclusive workplaces. Specifically, the general education provided to employees about discrimination and harassment, recruitment and outreach to diverse communities, mentoring and career leadership development opportunities, retention and promotion strategies, and equal opportunity for employees in diverse workplaces. For minority and small businesses, the attacks seek to eliminate inclusive procurement practices, the general support for business development, and the prevention of economic disparity studies, data collection, tracking, and accountability measures to ensure equitable contracting practices. There are also negative economic impacts. Now that some anti-DEI laws have been in effect for a year or more, we expect to see and will explore the negative economic impacts on states, municipalities, and private sector employers, such as increased exposure to employment discrimination lawsuits and resulting monetary settlements, reduction in revenue due to residents moving from states with these restrictive laws, and a reduction in tourism. Notably, although DEI programs are being weaponized largely against racial minorities, many other constituencies will lose access to education, employment, and public contracting opportunities under the legislative attacks against DEI on the federal and state levels, including women, the LGBTQ+ community, veterans, people with disabilities, persons from low socioeconomic backgrounds of all races, persons who live in rural communities, and immigrants. Next slide, please. So what can you do? We believe that stakeholders may engage defensively and offensively in the face of these attacks. And this can be done through education and outreach concerning the vast negative impacts of anti-DEI laws, the significant population of individuals who will be negatively impacted, and the potential negative economic impacts on public and private entities. Next slide, please. In addition, the ACLU has developed what we call a firewall for freedom to encourage stakeholders to lobby the following state and local officials to counter the ongoing attacks against DEI and potential threats from a Trump administration. First, attorneys general may issue guidance to school districts, superintendents, and charter school administrators concerning the legal requirements for providing inclusive curricula, instructional materials, and books. They may also issue guidance to other local and state officials concerning the legality of public sector DEI programs in education, employment, and public contracting. There is a precedent for this. Coalitions of attorneys general have already submitted letters to the Bar Association, to Fortune 100 CEOs, and other organizations that have been unfairly targeted for their commitment to DEI programs. In addition, there's been one attorney general from California who issued guidance this year and in 2023 concerning the legal requirements for providing inclusive curricula, instructional materials, and books. Second, governors and mayors may issue executive orders to create and expand DEI programs in state and local agencies and incorporate DEI goals into economic tools and policies. We believe that governors and mayors may use President Biden's existing racial equity executive orders as a model. These executive orders, for example, can include provisions mandating practices to comply with federal and state non-discrimination laws. In addition, mandates for equity assessments and monitoring of government policies and programs, the establishment of equity teams and development of mandatory equity plans, including performance measures, creation of incentives and guidelines for specific diversity initiatives. Executive orders can also include the development of statewide initiatives to advance educational equity for students in early childhood, elementary, secondary, and post-secondary educational institutions. To ensure the equitable allocation of government contracts and funding, executive orders can also mandate that state subsidies be provided to private companies that implement equity-related initiatives. And also, these executive orders can prohibit state funds from being used to restrict or interfere with DEI initiatives or programs, or an underserved community's access to government resources, programs, or facilities. Finally, state assemblies should be lobbied to enact laws mandating inclusive curricula and prohibiting the banning and removal or restriction of books. For example, states currently mandating inclusive curricula include California, Colorado, Illinois, Nevada, New Jersey, Oregon, and Washington. And states that currently prohibit book bans include California, Illinois, and Maryland. Thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to hearing your feedback and collaborating with you all as partners in the fight to protect DEI programs.
Yes,
Thank you. Thank you both.
And there was one thing I just wanted to go to the last slide, which was just flagging a few additional resources. Obviously, the ACLU of Massachusetts is an amazing resource, and I know Tracy Griffith is on the call, the Director of Racial Justice Programs there. So she can also be a resource specific for Massachusetts work. Here's a number of materials that Kim and I have created around censorship, the attack on DEI, the interplay between the two. And then I also have to give just a quick disclaimer, because we are attorneys, that our presentation does not endorse everything the task force is doing or might do in the future. We are happy to collaborate in the future. That's it.
Thank you both. People have questions, comments? Oops, there we go. I see we're joined by Representative Lewis as well as having the chief here. Anybody have questions, comments?
Mayor
for our
Mayor
speakers?
Ryan, I had one quick question. So for a lot of us that are the stakeholders in our different communities, and I saw that you talked about how we can collaborate, come together with the AG and other offices. Have you seen, specifically in those states that you're litigating in, grassroots efforts between, you know, whether it's a community-based organization or a group of people or DEI directors and consultants coming together to do grassroots work around this issue? Because I feel sometimes that people don't see it recognized in their community as being attacked, may not be as vocal. So I'm just wondering if you have seen a consistent grassroots effort that has really kept this discussion at the forefront.
I'll jump in here unless you want to go first, Kim.
You can start.
Okay. So I'll speak. Have we seen grassroots efforts to resist the attack on DEI and the broader and also in the broader censorship movement? And that answer is yes. I would say in different ways. Well, with mixed results. In Florida, the state legislature has an overwhelming majority, is overwhelmingly conservative. And so those efforts haven't defeated the legislation, but there have been ways that people have tried to reduce the impact of the legislation, and there have been other efforts to get the word out about it. I think some of the efforts that we've seen, a lot of organizing around testifying at the legislative hearings, which sometimes in response, the legislature has limited the comments of each person to like 30 seconds or 15 seconds. But I think the response from the community, organizing from the community, and a lot of information sharing about what is happening, and then even if legislation passes, what it means and what it doesn't mean, and limiting the impact has been something that the ACLU of Florida, our individual affiliates in each state have been involved in, and also tracking very closely just the ways that people are being impacted. So there is organizing around that, even when in the worst case scenario, a law does pass. In other places, we've seen really coordinated grassroots efforts in South Carolina, in Indiana, in very conservative places, even in Alabama, for one legislative cycle where they were able to defeat legislative efforts altogether or limit the scope of legislative efforts either indefinitely or for years, that they're putting off the legislation that's been proposed, narrowing what's been proposed. And we've also seen a lot of pivoting with the ways that these censorious efforts and even the attack on DEI, they're all lumped together with this common goals, but the ways that these items are structured, especially in response to our litigation, have been changing and becoming less flagrant in some ways that are obviously unconstitutional.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you to both of you, Leah and Kim, for taking time to be with us this morning. I'm grateful. Thank you. Now, turning to our next speaker, Catherine Henderson. Catherine joined YW Boston as a community outreach coordinator in 2009, and she came to that spot with over 10 years of experience as a nonprofit program manager. In 2022, she was promoted to the Chief Engagement Officer, overseeing the organization's external partnerships through leadership, advancement, marketing, communication, advocacy, and engagement efforts. And she's currently serving as the interim president and CEO. And prior to being at YW, Catherine was the national program manager for a great program, Reach Out and Read, an acclaimed youth literacy programs. She's also worked with the Literacy Volunteers of Massachusetts and MOVA, the Massachusetts Office for Victims Assistance. In addition to all of that, Catherine serves as an adjunct professor at Tufts and Bay State College and is a member of NEHRA's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Board. She has a bachelor's degree from the College of the Holy Cross and a master's degree from Springfield College, and is a 2011 graduate of Lead Boston. So Catherine, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you, District Attorney Ryan, and for your colleagues for including me and the Suffolk County organization I represent at a Middlesex County gathering. I'm excited to join and hopefully can build on the great remarks and information that Leah and Kim shared. I will share my screen. I've got a few slides. Great. So I want to talk a little bit about taking the pulse of diversity, equity, and inclusion today in Massachusetts and try to build off that really wonderful framing about the national, what's happening nationally and the legal challenges, and then how we're seeing those play out across the country and here, and talk more about then our partner organizations. We work with orgs across all industries and sectors, and the impact of all the backlash, threats, legal challenges on them and the day-to-day work they're trying to do. I briefly want to share that we are part of YWCA USA. We all share the same mission. We're dedicated to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. We are the first YWCA in the country, founded in 1866, though New York likes to claim that they are, which is pretty typical in the ongoing kind of rivalry between New York and Boston. Our work includes, we work with partner organizations going into their organization, either virtually or physically in person, to help them develop more inclusive practices, measure the impact of their work, come up with action plans and implement those plans, etc. We offer leadership services, including communities of practice for human resources and DEI professionals, as well as the Lead Boston program, an inclusive leadership cohort-based model. We also do youth development through a program for middle school age girls, advocacy, so speaking out and on behalf of legislation that we think will build more inclusive organizations, and community building and ongoing learning. We really want to be a place where people can come together, again, across all industries and sectors, across all identities, and share resources, share their challenges, share opportunities, because we know the cliche that this work is a marathon is real, and no one's going to do it alone. So where we stand and where we're headed. Leah and Kim talked about the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion, so I'm not going to spend time on that. But I will say that how are national efforts to undermine DE&I impacting the organizations we partner with and hear from? some of this echoes what you heard earlier, the politicization. We're seeing Massachusetts organizations changing their language. So stepping back from using DE&I, using different acronyms, different words, using words like belonging instead of any of these other words. We're seeing organizations scale back their efforts. We're seeing budgets get reduced. And we're also seeing confusion and concern about the legal risks. So again, echoing some of what you heard, a lot of our partners are preemptively making changes without even having been directly challenged yet. And so it is the fear that these headlines and legal challenges put into organizations where they are not willing to tolerate the risk of a possible lawsuit. So they're self-editing, self-constraining the work they're trying to do or have been doing. And really, I think that's largely the intended impact of these lawsuits, is the chilling effect. And it, for many partner organizations, especially those who may not have an in-house legal team, who may depend on pro bono support, that chilling effect is working. And then we see human resources and DEI leaders under increased pressure. So if you think about their budget has reduced, they're more often hearing from employees and external community members who feel emboldened to challenge the work they're doing. So they're on their heels, feeling more defensive. And when we talk with our the folks in our HR and DEI professionals community of practice, they're really talking about hearing from, they're failing to put the mask on themselves and instead helping everyone else. And that's leading to burnout. It's leading to folks leaving their roles, increased mental strain and hardship on people really trying to do this work. So that's some of the challenges we're seeing and trying to work with our partner organizations to support them through this. And I want to note that when we hear DE&I used really effectively as a slur and turned into a challenge of someone was a quote DEI hire, meaning they did not earn their role, they were given it because they hold one or more marginalized identities. That's really not just harming the work we're trying to do, it harms individuals very directly. So I want to acknowledge that this creates real pain and hardship for individuals. So what are the things, some of the things we're talking about with our partners is to take a fresh look at their DEI efforts. I want to echo what Leah and Kim shared. Are your efforts closely aligned with your mission and values? That is a protective factor. If they don't seem to have anything to do with how you talk about your work, the work you're trying to do, or the values you say you hold, that disconnect is a potential area of risk. And then taking a look at the language you're using. You don't necessarily have to not say diversity, equity, and inclusion, but you do want to make sure you're avoiding language that might sound like or is a quota. So doing that risk management work, doing that review now and really continuously, maybe it's every year, every couple of years, to make sure that the DEI efforts you have underway continue to align with the work you're doing and your values. Also, really looking at, is this a separate stream? How do you embed these principles across your organization at every level throughout? So instead of being a standalone effort, how are they woven into everything you do all the time? And then we are talking with our partners. We recently held an event around this about preparation. The best time to prepare is before a crisis occurs, of course. And we have an extremely contentious election season underway. We have two candidates with very different visions particularly as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion work, taking the time to stop and say, what are the opportunities and challenges of the potential outcomes? And there are opportunities and challenges no matter who steps up into office. And thinking about how do we mitigate the challenges? What can we be doing now, if anything? And how could we take advantage of opportunities? An opportunity, for example, for us is that when we see threats to DE&I nationally, more people actually want to support our work. Frankly, people get angry, and when they get angry, they want to take action. And so that's a potential opportunity. And another area we are talking about with our partners is just generally thinking about how they can strengthen their organizational culture. We really see the backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion happening hand in hand with other changes in the workplace. For example, we have younger employees, newer to the workforce employees, increasingly expect to talk about current events in the workplace. They are not leaving these conversations at home as maybe I was raised to do or my parents were raised to do. And that can create intergenerational conflicts within the workplace. How do you prepare for those conversations in a way that supports people's right to express their values and their opinions, but also while also treating everyone with dignity and respect? So we think about building resilience in your organizational culture, where are potential areas to strengthen, and what are strengths of your org culture you can deepen and build on. And the same goes for psychological safety. And that's, I think, a really trendy term these days. So I will share briefly what I'm talking about. So psychological safety within a team is a shared belief by members of that team that it's okay to take risks, to express ideas and concerns, and to speak up with questions, and to admit mistakes without fear of negative consequences. And so we know that when that's in place, teams are more effective, folks feel more included, and when a difficult thing comes up, whether it's an internal workplace issue, layoffs, for example, or external events are brought into the workplace, the war in Israel and Gaza, that psychological safety is going to be a protective factor for your organization and help you weather those conversations, get through those moments more successfully. And the last thing really I want to touch on is that we're thinking about is how do you build on and lean on your community? Folks doing this work often feel isolated. Now there are very public daily attacks on the work, so that isolation is probably heightened for some people. Again, especially if you are doing or advocating for diversity, equity, and inclusion and yourself hold one or more marginalized identities. So we need our community. It's easier to remain steadfast and courageous when you have a peer network. And I'm going to shout out MAPC. They offer a community of practice for municipal DEI professionals, and I know at least one person on this call is a member. We also at YW Boston offer communities of practice for human resources and HR professionals, and that's across all sectors. We host free webinars and in-person gatherings to bring folks together for learning and connection. And I'll share some resources in the chat when I'm done that you can learn more about. And I was also curious what other community resources folks in this group on this call have been using that maybe others might want to tap into as well. And I think the one thing that I forgot to mention, but I made a note of, is that in this moment, to respond to the backlash, there's a debate amongst folks about do we just keep pushing forward and we say, you know, you can make fun of this term, you can weaponize this term all you want. We're still saying this language. We are going to remain bold. We are not backing down, and sort of not worry about whose comfort we're prioritizing. And then others saying, I don't care what words we use as long as we keep doing the work. There's not necessarily a right or wrong there. It's again about thinking of making sure you're grounded in your values, you're clear on your goals for diversity, equity, and inclusion. They map to your organization's culture and mission, and then moving forward. So I'd welcome any questions or reactions to what I shared.
Questions, comments? Stephen Morris, did you have a question earlier? I might have cut you. We might have missed you.
I don't have any questions. This is Angela Clark, Attorney General's office. I just want to say, Catherine, a pleasure to meet you. I just want to thank you for the work that you and your organization are doing. I definitely need to be more involved in that and just sort of better understand your team's work. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
I just had a quick question, dear, right? And I guess this is to everyone that's presented, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about these issues, the attack on DEI and so forth, and the conversations that we've had in kind of these professional settings, recently I've just been sitting in on some community events just as a resident, and I don't know if it's a shock or just a question of whether or not just regular people, like maybe it could be from an immigrant perspective or people of color that are used to being in their cities and towns, them really understanding their impact and their role in DEI. Because I think a lot of times when you are looking from the perspective as a person of color, it's just part of you that you are different and you show up differently in different spaces. But I think there was a sense of like they weren't empowered enough to come in and be part of these conversations in these organizations. And I just wonder if some of us, like a lot of us, we're in all different areas within our municipalities, if to be mindful of that, of just really empowering people in our communities that might not necessarily know or recognize the attack that's happening on DEI, but it's against them, right? It might be something they have to face with, but they don't know the different resources or what the language is when they're having these conversations about their livelihood or you know, their being. So I'm just curious of that work and how, if that's happening, that we're really reaching back to just everyday folks in having these discussions around DEI, belonging, inclusion, because I think that's really important to this work that we're doing.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Catherine, thank you so much for being with us and for that valuable information. All right, and we are right on time. Anybody have anything they want to share about programs they are running, upcoming events, anything people will share? I thank everybody for being here. We will roll out that information about the telephone line. And if anybody has any topics you'd like to see us addressing, please feel free to reach out to Antonia. And I want to thank again Leah and Kim and Catherine. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy this beautiful weather. Thank you, guys.